It is time to speak from the seat of the sage, out by the well of origin. I saw and was quiet. I saw and contemplated. I listened to the speech of people. About runes I heard speak, and counsel was given. By the High One's hall, in the High One's hall, I heard them speak like this. Håvamål, the speech of the High One, stanza 111, the poetic Edda. Hello, my name is Maria Kvilhaug, and I am the author of the book The Seed of Yggdrasill. Now, when I look at the introduction, because I had to obviously look into my own book a little bit before starting to reading it out loud as an audio version of the book. So I looked at the intro, and well, the intro was written back in 2012. The book came out the first time in 2013. Now it's been republished in 2021. It was republished by the Three Little Sisters. Now, looking into the book and at the intro, I realized that I might have expressed myself a bit differently now, so many years later. A bit older, a bit wiser. So I'm just going to offer you a sort of spontaneous introduction where I just talk a little bit about how the work behind the Seed of Yggdrasill actually is intimately linked to my own life in a way. So I was born in 1975, that's 46 years ago now, and I was born in Norway, and I grew up in Norway, and I also come from a family where lots of people were very interested in history, even though many parts of the family were not actually academics or somewhere, at least my parents were, but my father came from a working class background, and still people read a lot and took an interest in both world history and local history, and history in general was very much a part of my upbringing. I was taken to museums, I was reading books, I was taken to all kinds of ruins. Wherever we went to see ruins a lot. So and museums. So I grew up with people who were very interested in history and in storytelling. And since I am Norwegian, and since I grew up in Norway, then I was, of course, also exposed to and introduced to the Norse myths and the sagas from an early age. And I had particularly one grandfather, my father's father, Einar. He was he could recite poetry, Edda poetry, for example, or tell stories from the sagas that he had read, and so yeah, it was a part of my upbringing. And I was 9 years old once, and I went to the mountains with my parents, and I remember walking up there in the mountains in the autumn, and the mountains were, it was all reddish. It looked like a Mars landscape because it was autumn, and it was all red and no trees up in the mountains, so it looked like a Martian landscape. And there, for some reason or other, my father told me about the old Norse gods, about Odin and Frey and Thor and all these, Loki. He just told me a lot about it, and I asked him whether or not these gods still lived, because they were gods. And he said that he thought that they lived on for as long as people believed in them and remembered them. And I asked, what happens if people forget about them? And he said, well, then they die. And I felt so sorry for those poor gods. So I remember this sense of standing there to the mountains, endless landscape, and just promising the gods that I would help remembering them. I would make sure that they were remembered and that I would believe in them. So I forgot, of course, about that promise until I was a lot older. So when I was like a teenager, I was becoming a woman, and I was very interested in women's history, and especially goddesses. I thought that was very powerful. I think I identified as a goddess. I didn't have low self-esteem in that sense. I was very discreet about it, but yeah, I knew that I needed to connect at least with these old powers, and I went really deeply into all sorts of, especially female-oriented mythology of the world. And I sort of dismissed the Norse pantheon for a while, not completely dismissed, but it was, I felt it was, at least from the way that it had been taught to me. The people who taught it to me were men, my father, my grandfather, teachers, they were men, and they gave me stories that I remember. So they were mostly about men or male gods, and I was interested in things that sort of reflected who I was. So I wasn't that interested in it until I actually left Norway, which was a bit ironical, but because I had to actually leave my own country to sort of take a more active interest in the cultural, historical past of where I had grown up. So I went to England, and while I was there in England, I was 21 years old, and I walked into this bookstore, and there stood, in the middle of the room, there was this book that just stood out to me, the poetic Edda, translated by Caroline Larrington. And I looked at it and I was like, what? Do people know about this here and translate it to English? I was a bit impressed, actually, because this was a long time before the internet. I hadn't been abroad except on holidays. So this was the first time I was actually, I had read English. My mother was an English teacher, so I learned English from a very early age, and I spoke it very well. I remember I came into Manchester the first time, and I had top grade in English. I had, been studying English. I'd read lots of English literature, and I came into Manchester and I didn't understand a word that people said to me. So it took me about 2 weeks before I started to decipher the accent. And I really liked being there in mid-North England, and I had no idea that there would be any sort of interest in Norse mythology this way, that there would actually be translations of the poetic Edda. And as I was to learn during my 4 years in England, was that English people tended to be, anyone, not people. I lived there 4 years and I didn't meet any heathens or anything like that. I hardly knew that they existed, but I met lots of other people, and almost anyone, everybody, not only English people, but all the, there were lots of foreign students there that I dealt with Asians, Japanese, Indian, and some Bulgarian and Greeks, and everybody kept asking me about the Vikings and about Thor, Odin, and Freya. That they were the gods that people knew about, and I was really surprised about this interest. And also, since they asked a lot, I started to sort of focus more on that. So these people from all parts of the world actually helped me start to take a new interest, because I wanted to have something to tell them when they asked me. For some reason, people ask me about this all the time. So I don't know, maybe the fates just sent people to ask me about it to make me, well, that's maybe a bit superstitious, but I'm an academic, So yeah, I also have a sense for the mystical, so that's okay. Where was I? I don't have a script for this introduction, so bear with me. Well, I went home. I didn't buy the book. What an idiot, eh? It stood right there in front of me, and it struck me as something very special and weird. And I just walked out of there like, no, I'm not having this. Maybe I sort of knew that it would just take over my life. So I left, and I came home, and I went to sleep, and I dreamt this dream about this woman who was not a woman, actually. She had a skull for a head, and the skull was that of a mare, a horse. And she was rowing a boat, and I was in that boat, and she was rowing it into a large underground caves, sort of, with river networks going through. And I sat there and I let my fingers run through the waters, and I started to see things in the walls, in the cave walls, and in the water. I saw ruins and lost stories, lost civilizations, lost cities, lost villages, things that had been forgotten in Hel, which sort of means the hidden, the place where things hide, the world of the dead. And she turned around, and I saw this face of a skull, a white mare horse skull, like that Celtic, Irish mare with a name that I cannot pronounce. I don't remember more detail, actually, but it was a very powerful dream, and the sort of lucid dream where I knew that I was dreaming, and I thought that I was in another world, and the whole day after, I had this image of these Norns. These Norns, they were pulling threads, sort of, and I can't really describe it, but it was there with me the whole day until I just gave in and went back to the bookstore and bought the Poetic Edda in English translation. I think the reason, I remember now actually, the reason why I thought now I won't buy the English version, because the reason was that I had these books at home in Norway. My parents had them. We had the Poetic Edda in at least 2 different translations into Norwegian. Since Norwegian is a lot closer to the original language, I thought that I would be better off reading them in my own language. But these ladies didn't want me to wait, so I went and bought the English version. And I read it, and I read it, and I read it. I was actually, at the same time, I was actually reading the Bible too. Not because of religious interest at all. That was, no, it wasn't. But it was an ancient script, an ancient historical document that said a lot about people who lived a long time ago, and so I was interested in all that. I was reading the Bible and I was reading the Edda, both things in English. And I had read both things before in Norwegian, both the Bible and the Poetic Edda in Norwegian, but it was a long time ago, and I was very young, so it was probably just a few years back, but it was a long time ago for me back then. It's not like now when 20 years seems like 2 weeks ago. Again, this is spontaneous. I don't have a script, so bear with me. I'm trying. So I was reading and I was contemplating, reading again, contemplating again, making notes, and I realized that it was almost as if there was something that was lost in translation. I mean, it was a very good translation. I still have Caroline Larrington's The Poetic Edda in English. It's a good translation. It's not that, but sometimes she translated names, not all the time, but sometimes. And whenever she did that, I felt that, the whole verse became more meaningful. And I started to think that maybe the names actually are meaningful. Maybe they are crucial to understanding. And you see, I was reading the Bible, I was reading parables. And this was parables. I thought parables is something that people did use a lot in ancient days. That was a parable is when you tell a story about something, but it's not really about that thing you are telling. Like in the Bible, you find lots of parables, for example, about birds who are, they don't work, they just trust that the nature will provide with seeds, so they just fly around finding seeds. And it's sort of a parable then about, it's a parable about how we too, human beings, we should just trust in God to provide and not fret and worry about things. And you have another parable, not from the Bible, but from Indian lore. It's where you have this god Krishna who is making love with lots and lots of gopis. Gopis are shepherd girls. And he could do that because he was God, and he could be many versions of himself. I mean, infinite versions, countless versions of himself. And the gopi, and this is not really a story about a horny god who wants to have sex with lots of girls. It is a parable again about how God, even if God is enormous and universe, he is also he can love each human being who seeks him. He can love each individual on an individual level and deeply, even though they have to share him, because they all get their own version of him. So it's about the union between the individual soul and the great all soul. And again, these parables were very common all over the world in ancient days. Symbolical, allegorical, metaphorical stories that really meant something about the human soul and about enlightenment or about union with a god or something like that. And I started to sort of suspect more and more that something similar was going on in the Poetic Edda. And I realized that I had to sort of figure out what these names actually mean in order to figure it out. So when I came back to Norway for a summer holiday, and I was working as a newspaper delivery girl that summer, I think. Yeah, that was what I did then. Or was that? Well, I was working anyway. But in my spare time, I actually spent most of my spare time in the National Library of Norway in Oslo. In the cellar there, you could find these old works, lots and lots of dictionaries, and I could find the original translations. No, not translations, but the actually original texts there. So I could actually read them in the Old Norse language. And that was very ambitious, of course, because I had some Old Norse. When I say Old Norse, I am referring to what we in modern Norwegian call norrøn. Norrøn is the word we use for the language and the culture and the religion and the mythology of the people who lived back in the Viking Age and a little bit into the medieval age. So basically the Viking Age. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say Old Norse. Anyway, I found the Old Norse texts, and it was of course a bit hard to read that, but I had some education there. I had gone to a what's called high school, college, when I was like 16, 17 years old. We had norrønt. That is Old Norse language in school, in class. So I remember we had to, for example, read the first couple of chapters of the saga of Halfdan the Black. The reason we had to read that one was because it was about the first king to unite all of Norway, and Halfdan the Black was his father. So and Halfdan the Black had a wife who was called Ragnhild, and she was a woman who was very wise, and she dreamt great dreams. So I remember it was very similar to Norwegian when I read that. So it said Ragnhild drottning drømde drauma stora. That means well, I'll just tell it to you in Norwegian first, so you can hear that it's very similar. Dronning Ragnhild drømte store drømmer. Ragnhild drottning drømde drauma stora. It is similar. It means that Queen Ragnhild dreamt great dreams, and she dreamt a dream which is again a parable. It was a dream about a tree that grew out of her dress and grew so large that its branches reached all over Norway. And this dream is, of course, a parable about how her son, that she was pregnant with at the time of her dream, would become king of all the different little kingdoms or tribes of Norway. So they too had these parables. And since I had already been introduced to this older version of our language, and I sort of managed to read through the Edda poems with the help of dictionaries and with the help of 4 different translations, 2 different translations into 2 different branches of Norwegian. We have something called bokmål, which means book speech, and it's the sort of it's a language that is very similar to Danish, because Norway was once a sort of submissive partner with Denmark, a bit like a little bit like a colony, and we so all the nice, all the high class people would write and read in Danish. So book speech, bokmål in Norwegian, is the written language that we sort of inherited from Danish. And then there is another written language, nynorsk, New Norwegian, which is really based on Old Norwegian. It's sort of more old-fashioned and more dialect-based Norwegian. So we have 2 systems, and people can choose which one to write, and we all learn how to read both. So I had one translation into nynorsk, this dialect, older style language, and one into book speech, bokmål, and I had one into English and another one into English that I borrowed at the library, and I don't actually remember which one that was. But yeah, I also had these 4 different translations, and the more I was reading and comparing these different translations and the original text, I realized that it makes a lot of sense trying to read it in this language, because all the translations were very different from each other. So if I wanted to sort of understand these poems and these possible parables that I was looking for, I would have to read it in the original language. And I managed to get through that by comparing the text with 4 different translations, and with a whole bunch of dictionaries, both sort of a new modern dictionary and also some really old ones with some very interesting translations. For example, there was this one dictionary that I think was from the 1890s, a very old one, where it says that Gylfi, the King Gylfi who appears in the prose Edda, who seeks out the Aesir, the gods, well, it's said there that Gylfi means a sorcerer who can change into a woman every 9th night. And I've never been able to verify this anywhere else, but I wrote this down in my notebook. So sometimes if you look to really old sources, then you find some interesting perspectives that you might not find in more recent works. And you have to be a bit careful about using that assertively, because sometimes the reason why you don't find it in new work is because it has been dismissed as not true. But sometimes maybe it just has been forgotten. So it's worth checking into, I think. Anyway, I was a 21-year-old woman who spent her entire summer holiday in working, and the rest of the time in the library, obsessing about the poetic Edda. And then I went on to the prose Edda, of course, during the same process, and I wrote a huge thick notebook full of possible translations. I think many of my translations, some of them were really good already then, but of course I was new in the game and I had no supervision, no teacher to actually teach me how to translate and how to understand Old Norse names. And I don't mean person names now. I mean mythological names, place names, names of the gods and other powers that appear in the myths. This was what I wanted to translate and find possible translations. So, of course, in the beginning, I probably did a lot of wrong translations, but it's a part of the learning process. And sometimes it's really hard to translate a language that is so similar to my own, because sometimes I get it confused. Like, we have a word today in modern Norwegian, feig, that means cowardly. But if you go back to, if you read a saga in the original language, the word feigr appears, and it means that you are about to die. So it has a very different meaning after 1,000 years. And so sometimes, of course, I did mistakes by assuming that a word that sounded and seemed so similar to my own would be the same, because there are, of course, lots of words that are almost the same today as they were. But sometimes the words change meaning over time. So, but discovering that I had probably made mistakes, that was also a very important part of learning, because it started to teach me that you can't really assume just because something feels right, because you think that, oh wow, yeah, I figured that out, it doesn't always mean you're right. And that, when you understand that, that is when you start to grow. And it became many years of a continual process of this thinking that I had finally understood it. Now, oh yeah, that's it, that's what it means. And then boom, it's something else. And when you start to open up and be this flexible about changing your convictions, that something happens. And I feel that was a blessing. Difficult to sometimes just having to leave a pet idea. It's something you really like to believe, but you had to leave it because it wasn't what it meant. So, and I spent years and years and years thinking something, then having to revise everything over and over and over again, and with each time I reached so much deeper. I still find translations that I could have done differently today, but it's all none. When I look at by the time I was this, you have to see this was back in the 1995, 96, 97. It was a long time before I wrote the Seed of Yggdrasill. So by the time I wrote that one, absolutely most of my translations I can still stand for. I have some places, they still make sense, but sometimes now I might find one or two names that I could have translated better in a way. But it's good enough. I don't have many mistakes, actually. It's just a matter sometimes of interpretation nowadays. So how I interpret it. One way in which that I worked with the myths was actually to draw a cartoon. And this was my first sort of work that I did with Norse mythology. And drawing the stories, well, it made me spend a lot of time in contemplation of each line, each verse, because it had to be drawn. It has to signify something when I drew. So this was a very intuitive approach. It was based on all that sort of research that I had been doing. But it was also a very intuitive way of working with it, and it made me dream a lot. And sometimes your subconscious sometimes understands things that doesn't get all the way up into the frontal lobes. So through dreams, I sometimes really understood things through dreams, but I didn't let those visions or dreams rule how I would work with them. I just used those dreams for inspiration, and then I checked out if I could have argued this academically, and surprisingly, I could. Very often, my dreams just put me right to the point of something. They made me realize what was missing, because I started to read these poems as riddles to be deciphered. They were riddles to me. So sometimes I was pondering these riddles, one riddle after the other. Each verse could hold one riddle. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what these riddles meant. And when I thought I had figured out what they meant, then I started to draw. As an artwork, it's not something I'm ever going to publish. It was a first draft, and I never got to make it into a last and final draft. So, and it's too much. It was just too much. But I spent 3 years on this first draft of a cartoon, graphic novel kind of thing about Norse myths, trying to convey how I understood it. And this was before I decided that, no, you know what, I have to do this in a university academic setting. So and I also need to actually learn how to translate these works in a professional way. So I had to go to university. So I did live in England for a while. I lived abroad, away from Norway. I lived in Mexico, Mexico Bella. I love that. And I lived in Portugal, which was also nice. I did spend some time in the US at some point, and so I achieved this international outlook. I didn't have this. Well, Norway wasn't the whole world anymore, actually, and it's actually interesting to see that people who have been abroad a lot, well, it's very educating anyway. It teaches you that you can't really take any reality for granted, and because it's always different in other places. Even England is very different from Norway, even though we are more similar, but still very different. US even more different. Mexico also different. Even Portugal also different. Everywhere I lived, because I didn't just travel there, I lived in each of these countries. I was away from Norway for about 10 years, a decade. But I came home every summer, and I enrolled at university, because this was still at a time when it was possible to be at the university without actually being there. I just had to make sure that I returned home in time to take exams so that I got grades. So it was very free and suited me a lot. It was probably not very good career-wise, because I didn't make any networks. But I at least got good grades and managed to take the exams. And the only time I actually spent home in Norway during this decade was when I was studying. I took a university course on Old Norse philology, which is about the interpretation of ancient languages, so that I could more easily translate this language that I had tried to teach myself for a long time. So it was very valuable to actually go to university and take classes. It made it a lot more easy to work in this way. But I'm still learning. I think that today I have a better understanding of the language than I did back then. And lots of people are much better than me at this. But I painstakingly go through these texts, comparing with different translations and looking up different words in the dictionary. So now it's hard work, actually. And my focus is not so much on the linguistics as it is on the content. That's the content that really interests me. So all the philology and linguistic work and the grammars and everything is just something I had to get through to get to that content. So anyway, I returned to Norway around, I think that was after 10 years. I was back in Norway permanently in 2005. I had the year before that, in 2004, I had finished my master dissertation, which was The Maiden with the Mead, a goddess of initiation rituals in Old Norse myths. That was my first work, and this work really laid the basis for the Seed of Yggdrasill, actually. And in this work, I proved, my supervisors and my examinators, they agreed that I had proven that there was an underlying structure of initiation rituals in many of the Edda poems, and that it basically meaning that these stories are many different parables about much the same thing, about seeking a vision, about achieving a vision, about going into the underworld in order to retrieve what was shown in that vision. And in the underworld there is this, well, the underworld itself is dark and black and cold and hard and of course dangerous. So but within that realm, within that utter darkness, there is this golden realm where you find a glorious female being who serves the golden mead of poetry and memory and wisdom. So after I wrote this, I went through it actually happened after I wrote several of these big works of mine. I actually went through some hard time, some challenges, and I didn't get to, I had sort of expected that when I'd done this research work, and when it was agreed that I had proven it, then it would be easy to move on to take a doctorate, PhD, but it wasn't. So for various reasons, I don't blame anyone. I look at the work now, I realize that it could have been better, but I didn't know exactly what to do. So I spent a lot of time trying to write a Norwegian version of that thesis and publish it in Norway. But I sent the manuscript around and nobody even read it. They didn't think it was something that would sell, basically. So I was a bit at loss, and I had to work. And I lived for a while. And I still, worked with this. I started to work in English then, because I realized that lots and lots of people abroad have been asking me about this. All the time I've been abroad, people have been asking. Like I was a magnet for people wanting to ask me about Norse mythology and Vikings. So almost as if people in other countries, not in Norway, but in other countries, were really, really eager to want to know what I had to say about this. I don't know if all Norwegians experience this abroad, but I experience it all the time, and it was very much a part of why I became so interested in this. And I realized that, okay, maybe I should just write it in English. So I worked for a living, and next to that I worked on this, what was going to become eventually the Seed of Yggdrasill. At the time I called it the Odin Mysteries. So I kept studying. I kept I literally had hundreds, thousands of pages, with my analyses of various Edda poems and Edda myths. Back in 2009, I got together with the love of my life, and we I don't remember exactly, but I remember we were looking at YouTube movies. The reason why we were looking at YouTube movies was because we had no television or anything like that, and this was, well, as far as we knew, this was before the Netflix and HBO and all that. So we were looking at YouTube, and well, my man told me that maybe you should just start to share your work on YouTube. And well, okay, I did. And it took off in so many ways. I got so much response, and I learned a lot from that. I was really, it was a long and intense time between 2009 and around 2012, where I produced lots and lots of video lectures about my analyses of mythology. It was called The Hidden Knowledge in Old Norse Myths, and the channel is still Lady of the Labyrinth. The Lady of the Labyrinth comes from Knossos, from Crete, Minoan Crete, where we find this inscription saying that Labyrinthos Potnia received so and so many jars of honey. And Labyrinthos Potnia, that means the Lady of the Labyrinth. And since we have lots of labyrinths in Scandinavia too, I felt that it was close enough to, well, it means something to me and it's personal. So you have to be content with that. Sorry. Anyway, I was at some point contacted by a publisher in Denmark. And I'm not going to talk about that publisher. They didn't treat me well. And but the one good thing came out of it, and that was the book, The Seed of Yggdrasill, that I'm now going to read from. So I hope that you will enjoy this book. Thank you.
Mål at fylja, fular stol I Urdar brunn I såek och fagda, såek och hygda, lydda och manna mål, och förunar höjda döma, ne råd om fögd, hova hallo I, höjda exeas, hova.
Dear listener, this was my introduction to what is going to become an audiobook version of The Seed of Yggdrasill. I am financing the reading by letting it out on my Patreon, chapter by chapter. Well, some of the chapters are really long, so parts of chapters, but these will be published on my Patreon. For my patrons, there is a podcast opportunity on Patreon that I am trying to figure out how to use at the moment, and then I will be offering reading part by part of The Seed of Yggdrasill on my Patreon. Once the work is finished, which could take, I'm doing lots of other things on Patreon too, so it could take a year, but then there will be an audiobook. And my new publisher, the Three Little Sisters, will be publishing this and other books in English by yours truly. So also, as authors, have to live. We also need a livelihood, and we don't earn a lot, so if you want to support me and help me keep doing what I'm doing and keep producing things for you, then please join my Patreon. Thank you.
Valdi henne härföder, ringa och män, fäsbjölsspaklig och spåganda, så hon vitt och omvitt och väröld värja. Hörlusbå, the poetic Edda. Odin chose for her rings and gems for her wise stories and her magical divination. She saw widely, so widely, into all the worlds.